Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming out.
So today we want to learn a little bit more about you and your book, and maybe a little bit of your own background in geek culture.
Well, I've always been a geek. I remember some of the earliest movies I remember seeing were things like the Muppet movie and Return of the Jedi, E.T., things like that, and grew up loving, like a lot of people, I just watched Star Wars all the time and stuff like that. A lot of animation, puppetry stuff, and then I, got really into Star Trek when I was like in grade school, high school. Got really into Star Trek: Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, things like that, and and just have always been interested in geek culture. But the funny thing was, growing up with that stuff in the 1980s and 1990s, I, got to be around like 20-something, and I thought, okay, liked all that stuff. It was fun. It's kind of, for kids. That's what the culture kept telling me growing up. You like that stuff now. Now it's time to be an adult. Move on. Do something else. Sell your magic cards. Stop doing this. And then it exploded. And if anything, it just become even bigger in the past 20 years. So I. Instead of having to like put that stuff aside and move on, do something else, instead it's become everywhere, and to the point where I could write a book about it, a mainstream book. So I never had to grow up or put that stuff away.
So it's just been a constant evolution the whole time.
It just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
The geek culture.
So geek culture and writing. So as a creative writer, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and how you got your start as a writer.
Well, my background is in, I became interested in creative writing. I've written short stories and novels and things like that. And I think, I've always just been interested in fantasy. Growing up, I liked those things. A lot of the reason I wanted to write in the first place was I'd watch things like The Muppet Show or Star Wars or Star Trek, and I'd want to write something like that, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, whatever. I mean, as I got older and I started reading other things, I started reading non-geeky things. But I grew up reading like X-Men comics and Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff, and fantasy novels. And I read Dragonlance novels. People know Dragonlance novels. I was like, so when I went to college, and I went to college originally for math and science. And again, I was like a stereotypical, I thought, I'm going to be an engineer because I love Geordi LaForge. Like that was like my, he's like my hero, and I want to live on the Starship Enterprise, so I'm going to go to college, get a science degree, and then I'm going to work to try and bring about, I'm going to help invent transporters or something. But in my case, what happened was I also really loved art and the storytelling and the movies and TV and comics and all that stuff, and I always drew and wrote. And I got to college, and I don't know, I just found myself gravitating more and more toward the art kids, I guess. And there's a lot of overlap between, people in STEM disciplines and the arts. And I think actually people forget sometimes how much of an overlap there is between the two. And I'm an example of that myself. But in my case, I think I realized what I liked more were the TV shows and the movies and the comics and stuff. And I started finding myself wanting to take more creative writing classes and less, differential calculus classes. And so I just slowly followed that passion. And I still like math and science and all that. I think in my case, I realized it was more of a hobby or something I like reading nonfiction books about, and then I went more toward story writing and fiction. The weird thing, though, is when I went into creative writing, of course, the first thing they try and do, if anybody here has ever taken especially a college-level creative writing class, is they try to beat out of you an interest in fantasy and science fiction and any of that kind of stuff. They want you to write literary fiction, which would be stuff that's more the kind of fiction novels that don't really have aliens or ghosts or things in them.
You wouldn't necessarily see that in Faulkner or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. And they certainly don't want you to write genre fiction. They don't want you to write, Dragonlance novels or say, I'm going to write the next Star Trek, novelization or things like that. So I went through a period where my teachers really did their best to kind of push. And it coincided right around that time when I thought, okay, I'm growing up, I'm going to have to leave this stuff aside. But so one of my interests then, ever since then, because I've stayed, I just finished my PhD in creative writing, and so I do have more of an academic career as well, and I teach creative writing at university, and I understand where that literary fiction, genre fiction divide has come from commercially and historically, but I'm also interested in bridging that gap and kind of doing both. So that's kind of the challenge for me in my career. And a book like this is an attempt to try to show that a lot of that genre stuff, a lot of the geek culture stuff actually can have and often does have a real literary or artistic merit to it that I think often gets overlooked.
And that's something I want to maybe focus in on a little bit. One of the authors you reference a lot in your book is Peter Biskind, who wrote the book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. Knowing Star Wars is the focal point of this book, that was one of the things that drew me in and got me pretty excited about it. I saw Star Wars when I was 4 years old. I'm dating myself. Saw it in the theaters.
Very lucky. I did not.
Yes, indeed. True story. I actually fell asleep in the most climactic scene of the film because I was 4 years old. Since then, I watched it a few hundred more times. So Star Wars in 1977 was very much a product of its times in a lot of ways. So Lucas was a contemporary of people like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese. Yet in some of the criticism works by like Biskind, he tends to like cut him off from that group. So I'd like to hear more of your thoughts around that I think you refer to it in the book as the new Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, so like kind of going back to the last thing I said. There's been a long tendency to separate kind of like high art and the literary. Like if you go over to like the Art Institute, for instance, like if you go over to the Art Institute and look at the paintings that are on the wall at the Art Institute, and then you buy a pack of Magic cards, or a pack of Pokemon cards or something, like you can see that the Pokemon cards and the Magic cards are not hanging on the wall at the Art Institute. And if you talk to people who are in, especially like film critics or literary critics, the kind of books they're often talking about are not, if anything, they often have like hostility toward pop culture and especially things like Star Wars movies and stuff. So Biskind's, he comes more from that kind of he writes for Vanity Fair. He's from New York. I think he thinks himself as being like a high culture kind of guy. And in a book he wrote, it came out in the late '90s. It's called Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. It's looking at like 70s filmmaking, and he tries to make an argument that there's the last great decade for American cinema was the 1970s. The last great films were the films of that era. And then ever since then, Star Wars comes along. Star Wars kind of kills all that. It betrays it. And then ever since then, it's just been like pop culture junk that you get like 80s movies, 90s movies up until today. Now it's just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and then the Star Wars movies. And we've all heard variations of that argument. And so my book, I mean, I read his book when I was in college, and it was very popular, I guess a little bit after college. And there's certain ways in which I admire his argument, but I didn't think he was right, and I didn't really agree with that argument that Star Wars represented the end of like ambitious, artistic U.S. filmmaking. If anything, I thought Star Wars was an example of really ambitious, artistic filmmaking, and that Lucas himself was very much an example of 1970s culture. That that all the things that people tend to praise about 70s art cinema, and when I say art cinema, I just mean like a lot of stuff was very mainstream at the time in American cinema, but like a strong influence from like European art cinema. A strong influence from people like Kurosawa, strong interest in more experimental narrative techniques. Lucas was doing all those things. He was just as much into that. And part of why Star Wars was such a revolutionary film was because of those things. Those weren't things that people were like, oh, gee whiz, I like science fiction, I'll just put up with this other stuff. It was, in fact, those revolutionary techniques in realism and filmmaking that actually made Star Wars the film that people actually loved. So I was like, Star Wars wasn't a betrayal of it. It was like the epitome of it. And the things that people love about Star Wars are, in fact, those particular things. So just to give a quick example, if you've ever watched Hollywood films from the 1960s, a lot of films in the 1960s in Hollywood are shot on sound stages and back lots in Hollywood. One of the things they started doing more of around 67 or so, especially into the 70s, they started shooting more on location. So if you look at a film like Jaws, they originally wanted Steven Spielberg to shoot Jaws in a water tank in the back lot, like at a Hollywood studio. And Spielberg said, no, I'm not going to do that. It's going to look corny. It's going to look like The Creature from the Black Lagoon, like a 50s film. I want to go out onto the open sea and shoot there. And he had to fight for this. And they actually fired him off the picture. He got fired because he was going over time, over budget, and it was very difficult. And then they hired him back on because they were like, well, he's the only guy who can finish the picture. But part of what we love about Jaws now when you watch it, like if you've seen Jaws, is like they're really out on the open sea. And it's part of what makes that film more powerful. Star Wars was the same way. There's a lot of science fiction up until then where they're shooting it, if you've seen films like Forbidden Planet, or like other science fiction films of the period, they're usually shot in Hollywood studios on sound stages. And Lucas was like, I'm going to go out to like Tunisia and shoot there. I'm going to go out to Guatemala and I'm going to shoot there. And that's a large part of what makes Tatooine, what makes Yavin 4 like look like actual alien other planets. I mean, they look like actual locations. And that's a lot of people love about Star Wars. What people like is they like the realism of the settings, and they like those things. And those were what we call New Hollywood techniques. And if anything, I think fans tend to complain about the opposite. So when the prequels came out, part of what people didn't like about them, a lot of Star Wars fans, I mean, people do like the prequels, of course, but a lot of the older, more traditional Star Wars fans said, I don't want this to be shot on a digital backlot in front of green screens. I want this to be shot on actual locations. Why aren't they going out to? I even think if you look at if you look at Return of the Jedi, one of the things that always bothers me when I watch Return of the Jedi, which is a film I love, that was my first Star Wars in the theater, but when they go back to Tatooine, they're not going out to Tunisia. They go to Nevada. They just shoot in the desert there, and it looks like a totally different desert. It just doesn't look the same. And then the Ewok planet Endor it's the redwood forest just north. I mean, it's lazy on some level. I was like, by that point, Lucas didn't want to travel anywhere anymore. He was, he's like, I made this money. I'm not going out to. He hated traveling around the world making these films. He got sick. His stomach bothers him a lot and things. So he was like, it'd be easier, easier to go up to the redwood forest and go over to Nevada, and it's like that's what so it always bothers me on some level, but it loses a little bit of that, far-flung kind of quality. Because not to say those things are necessarily exotic, but they're familiar from other Hollywood films. We've seen endless Hollywood films set, like shot in the regions that are close to Hollywood, because everybody goes there to shoot them. That's why, because they're right there. They're just affordable and they're very available. So making that extra effort is like the realist New Hollywood commitment.
Gotcha. Yeah, and as a personal aside, just noticing that when reading your book, I didn't actually realize that until looking at the book about some of those things and how maybe there were some corners cut in the making of Return of the Jedi. But again, the realism factor really stands out. Like, I think you mentioned how when Luke sees the droids for the first time, he's very dismissive because he's used to that sort of thing. The point being this world making that's happening, right? And that that's the world that's lived in. And I think you also talk about that in the book around Tolkien and how the Lord of the Rings, for example, how that was actually just part of a larger mythology. So and it seems like Hollywood in general has been taking a while to catch up to this, right? You see that in Star Wars, you see that in Lord of the Rings, but that actually goes further back. And so you're beginning to see more of that today. So I'm curious about Jedi, 1983, kind of dies off. But then you have this sort of fan lore that begins to grow around Star Wars, like role-playing games, for example, and they kind of pick up the mantle for like creating the world. Maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the book, there's a lot in there. I mean, it's like, kind of like the whole book is like in those questions in some ways. So, I guess like the easiest way to explain it would be, so when I sat down to write this book, I mean, again, I told you I grew up as a geek. I also began to have this like experience where I was dealing more with like, people who taught literary fiction. I had teachers in my writing workshops who said, you can't write science fiction, things like that. So, I read this Biskind book. I became interested in like, why does that divide exist? Why is there a separation between high art and genre often? So that's one set of questions I had that I tried to answer when I sat down to write the book. And it's in some ways it's like a series of prejudices I was trying to overcome in writing the book. But I also had a series of questions about why, like, how did this aesthetic of geek culture develop? Like, if you think of geek culture as a community or as a demographic, how did it actually historically develop? Why is there more of it? Why is it more mainstream now? Why is it more above ground now than it was? Well, like, when did it start? Like, when did people start cosplaying? Like, when did it actually begin? When did people begin making up fictional languages of elves or things like that? Like there has to be a point where that started, right? When did people start having conventions? And then how did it, obviously when they started doing those things, it was clearly not as above ground or as mainstream as it is today. So how did it develop, and what are the forces that kind of, the cultural forces that took it and made it more mainstream? So that was a real question I had. And one of the ways I got into that was a question about, I remembered from my youth Star Wars disappearing, and I'm sure you remember this too. It's really funny, especially if you're a fan more of, if you're younger than us or if you know more Star Wars today. There was a period between 1985, 1986, and 1991, which again, it's only like 5 years, but those 5 years were an eternity when I was a kid, where Star Wars completely disappeared from the culture. It just completely was gone, which is shocking because the movies were so big. They come out in 77, run through 83, and by 1986, they stopped making, there were no more Star Wars toys, there were no more cartoons, no more TV shows, no more comic books. Marvel stopped making the comics, there were no more novels, there was nothing. They stopped making no more video games. It just went away. And it's unimaginable to think that would happen today, you know? So something clearly changed between then and now. And I was like, well, what was that? What happened? The main thing was, and this is what a lot of the book ended up being about, was even though geeks existed in 1986, even though they existed in 1966, geeks were very much more of an underground subculture. It was like a niche culture that, like, you know, growing up, I didn't know many people like me growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There was like 3 of us, you know, who were into this kind of stuff. The powers that be, you know, a lot of like companies and stuff, they didn't even realize it was a demographic they could actually market to. And even if they wanted to market to them, they didn't know how to. It was like, what kind of products would they actually even buy? You know, what could we do? What could we make? So what you begin to see, the first people who kind of really figure it out is Star Trek, because they see when Star Trek goes off the air in 69, and then all through the 70s, they're watching Star Trek fans have these conventions, and they go, wow, these people are like really into Star Trek. They're really not letting it go, right? And they think, well, how can we make some money off this, right? Like they're like, we don't really know how to make some money off it. They don't want to bring Star Trek back onto TV because that's not going to be profitable enough. They couldn't keep it on. But they go, well, what do they do? And one of the things they look at is they go, well, they write a lot of fan fiction. They go to the conventions, they see that all these people are writing fan fiction stories. And they go, well, maybe we'll create a line of Star Trek novels. And we'll actually invite some of those fan fiction writers to come and do that. So as it happened, in the very late 70s, when Star Trek, the motion picture comes out, Paramount they have their own, like part of the sprawling, you know, corporate conglomeration they belong to, they have their own publisher, and they go, we'll just hire some of these people, they'll write Star Trek novels. And what you're seeing there is the commercialization of fan fiction. It was one of the first things they figured out was we could do this, you could do that. So Lucas hadn't figured that out yet. That's like Paramount figures it out. Lucas then, he doesn't realize, even though he's kind of a geek himself, he doesn't realize that geeks exist as a demographic and that they're fans of Star Wars. As far as he's concerned, it's a mass market phenomenon, a mass culture phenomenon, pop culture phenomenon, and kids like it. So he's trying to make all the products for pop culture and for kids. But the problem is, pop culture moves on very quickly. It moves super fast these days. It moved fast even in the 80s. There's a lot of stuff out there vying for our attention, and people are like, yeah, I liked it, I went and saw it, and then I'm interested in something else. You know, some new movie comes out or something, you go see that. Kids also age out of products extremely quickly. If you make toys for kids, something they'll like when they're 5, they won't like by the time they're 7, or by the time they're 9. They age out of it very quickly. So they just thought that the market for Star Wars was gone by 1986, 1987. What they didn't realize was that the geeks were going to do the exact same thing to Star Wars that they had done to Star Trek. They were going to keep it alive themselves. And if the culture, if companies wouldn't make those things for them, they would make them themselves. So they start writing their own fan fiction. They start making their own costumes. And they're like, we're going to keep it alive. We want to actually like keep experiencing this world, this immersive experience of Star Wars. One of the things that happens then is a company called West End Games in 1987. They make role-playing games. They go, let's get the license to Star Wars, and let's actually make a Star Wars role-playing game. People will play that. So they get the license. I mean, nobody else wants Star Wars at that time, so they probably get it for like a song. And they start making the Star Wars, it comes out in 1987, the Star Wars role-playing game. And the thing is, if you're going to do a Dungeons & Dragons role-playing experience with Star Wars, you actually have to end up inventing a lot of stuff. Because so let's just picture what it would be like. You're playing the game, you go to the Mos Eisley Cantina, there's all the aliens there. Some of them are on screen for like 5 seconds in the movie. But you're in the cantina, you can go there, so you're going to go over and sit next to this guy sitting over by the bar and start talking to him. What's his name? Where's he from? Now, none of this is in the movie. So you go over and there's a toy made of the one, he's Hammerhead, you know? But you can't call him Hammerhead, right? Like, that's just a dumb name somebody at Kenner put on the toy in 1978 because they had no idea what else to put there, right? The guy doesn't have a name. I mean, the alien just doesn't have a name. So somebody at West End Games had to come up with a name. And they went, Momanadon is his name. And he's an Ithorian priest. And the reason why he's there in the cantina is because he was a priest on Ithor, his planet Ithor, and it got attacked by the Empire, and they wanted him to give the sacred agricultural lore of their planet, his jungles, which are like sentient, to the Empire. He refused, and then people thought he was a traitor, so they exiled him, and now he's in exile on Tatooine, and he has a garden south of Mos Eisley that he tends, but he's also an ally to the rebellion, and he will sometimes hide rebellion, rebels like in his garden and stuff. Okay, so now if you're like the DM in this game, you have a chance to actually like play this character and actually interact with stuff. Maybe you could actually go, we're on the run, like when Momanada's like, I'll help you and take you down to my garden. You know, you can actually play out that adventure, right? So they just have to invent all this stuff. And the people at West End Games are the ones who invented all this. And so they put this book out, it costs like $30, and it sells out, and it starts winning awards. And by 1988, 1989, George Lucas is sitting there, and like the receipts start coming in. He's like there's like money from, like Howard the Duck just failed, right? You know? So he's thinking, why is there money? So Howard Duck, nobody wanted to go see Howard the Duck, which is playing tonight, by the way, at the Music Box, 7 p.m. I'll be there. 70 millimeter too. But he's like, there's still, what's this Star Wars book? And he looks at it and he goes, I didn't invent any of this. It's like, what is this? I didn't invent any of this stuff. But he realizes he's a shrewd business person, Lucas is, and he goes, there's a market for this. So he begins to think, how can I sell this information back to the geeks? So 1991, Timothy Zahn, the first thing they do is they go, what does Star Trek do? They put out a series of novels. They go, okay, we're going to write a series of novels. That's the beginning of the expanded universe. And look, these people at West End Games did us a lot of work here. We're going to put all this stuff in. So they start actually taking the RPG and they start making stories out of them. By 1996, you can read Tales from Mos Eisley Cantina, which is a series of short stories, which is all the things that were in that RPG book now told as short stories. And one of them, of course, is the Sandherder's Tale. It's the story of Momanadon. It's just a written version of it. And then once they see people will do that, you can actually make a toy now in 1996 that's a Momanadon toy. And it's a little more detailed, and it has like a backstory. 2006, you can make an even more detailed figure. And gradually, they begin to figure out, oh, there's a demographic here that will purchase specialized products. Now, most people don't want this kind of stuff. Now, my parents went to see Star Wars. They have no interest in buying a Momanadon figure. Like, they don't know who he is. They don't care. But there's a niche market for this. And then little what they figured out that gradually through the 80s and 90s was they figured out how to monetize it. And then the other thing happens is the internet then, which you guys have heard of the internet, right? So it's, in 1993, you have the World Wide Web, and suddenly people can start putting all this information online. And suddenly you can have the Wikipedia. You can look this stuff up. Streaming, you can go back and watch all these things, And suddenly, like, stuff that used to be very hard to find, like when you say, well, Star Wars wasn't hard to find, but some of the stuff was hard to find. The Star Wars Holiday Special was hard to find, Issues of X-Men were hard to find, I remember trying to buy them in 1987 and going into the comic book store, which was like musty and had water damage and smelled like, the owner's dog and stuff, and I went in and it was like cobwebs, and I was like, how much for that issue of Uncanny X-Men 248? And he'd be like, $50. It's like, oh, I can't afford that. Like, I want to read it, but I can't afford that. I mean, now you can, whether legally or illegally, you can download these things, you can read them online, you can stream them. If you want to watch the Star Trek animated series, you can watch it on your cell phone. Things that it used to be very hard to find. So not only has that demographic, people have learned how to monetize it, that demographic has grown. And now it's easier than ever to get into it. And guess what? It tends to appeal to people who tend to work at companies like Google, work at companies like Microsoft, work at companies where they have disposable income. And they want to actually, enjoy these kinds of things. So increasingly you see that demographic growing.
Yeah, and even from my own personal experience, this past year was the first time I had ever gone to C2E2, taking my daughter there and realizing the crowd is growing. Yeah, there's the
Oh, yeah.
cosplay and all that stuff, but then you see a lot of families and you see a lot of growth of just attendance. And she's very excited that the Star Wars Celebration is going to be in Chicago next year. I got to give a plug for that. But I guess seeing that shift, what additional opportunities are you seeing? I think you spoke a little bit about that, but from a business and marketing side, like from your perspective as an observer.
Yeah, so what you see over the past, especially 25 years, 30 years, is you see, so in some ways I think of geek culture and the growth of geek culture as being analogous to the invention of teenagers that happened in the United States around World War II or so. So in the 1930s, they pass labor laws. Suddenly, kids and teenagers aren't allowed to work as much anymore. They're a protected class of citizen. It wasn't like that before that. After World War II, the United States becomes generally a prosperous, peaceful country. Of course, not everybody got to participate in that, but a lot of people did. And you have this growth of the middle class, especially in certain areas. And so you suddenly have this youth culture that has a disposable income that didn't exist before the 1930s. And you have this concept of a teenager. And there's this idea that if you're a teenager, what are the kind of things you should do? You should consume pop music, movies, go on dates, go out for burgers, things like that. And you have a whole culture kind of form around this. And once you have that demographic, they can begin making products for that demographic. So you can make things like the Beach Blanket Bingo movies, you can make drive-in movies, you can make, rock music, you can have things like, all those kinds of things. And again, not everybody gets to participate in this, but a certain number of people get to. Geek culture is something similar. It's a demographic that did not exist, at least in the eyes of Hollywood executives or people like that. Geeks existed, people with those interests existed, but they didn't actually exist in a way that people, as a market, as something that could be marketed to and specialized products could be made for. Part of what Hollywood likes about geek culture as a demographic is, one, it's a growing demographic. We have not hit the limits of its size yet. It's still, we're only 20, 25 years into I would even say it's only more like 15, 16 years of it being socially acceptable on some level. It was still kind of, in my book I say 1999 is kind of the watershed year where it kind of breaks into the mainstream. You can debate the particular year, but it's sometime around the turn of the century. So it's still a growth market. So people are still, more and more businesses and companies are getting into it, hoping they can make money in it. The other thing is, people don't age out of geek culture the same way they age out of being a teenager. If you're a teenager, how long are you a teenager for? 6 years, 7 years? But if you're a geek, you can be a geek for the rest of your life. I've been a geek for 40 years. I'll probably be a geek for another 40 years. I'll be a geek my entire life. I love this stuff. I'm always going to watch. I watched an episode of Star Trek Next Generation last night. I'll watch them again. It's I'm never going to stop loving these things. So from a business perspective, that's a lifelong, heavily enfranchised, branded consumer who's always going to be there and always be looking to spend their money and their leisure time on those kind of products if they like them. And the other thing they like about geeks too is that geeks, as you can probably see, geeks tend to be passionate about the things they love. They're heavily enfranchised. They call us great brand ambassadors because we will go out and we'll talk other people's ears off. We'll write blog posts, make videos, all for free. We'll make podcasts. We'll write books about the topic. This is free on some level. This is a book I wrote because I was trying to answer certain questions about the history of geek culture and how it evolved, and how the aesthetics of it have evolved over time. But on some level, this is free advertising for Star Wars, right? It's right there on the cover of the book. So Lucas didn't give me anything for that. I'm doing that for him. So as long as people are talking about it. So that's a large part of why it's still a growth demographic, and it's also one that if you could actually get those people, get geeks, they're a very highly valued type of consumer from the viewpoint. So two things I can see are, one, we're as much as geek culture has saturated U.S. culture and also world culture, we're nowhere near, I don't think, the limit yet. It's a growth market, and I think it's still a growth market. And then it's going to become an increasingly mainstream culture. And then on top of that, the politics of it, the really exciting story in a lot of ways is how the politics of it are changing. I think you wanted to ask a question too about that.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what we're really in the midst of now.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to talk about that because of how broad the fan base has become, and how geek culture is very much ingrained. It is pop culture in a lot of ways. Star Wars is very much mainstream, and I think it's really important to talk about that, talk about diversity and inclusion in the world of geek culture. So I mean, it's exciting to see that we've seen more of that in the past couple of years. But then thinking about like that broader representation in the culture, Star Trek, shout out, they did that day one with characters like Uhura, Mr. Sulu, and so forth. Star Wars began to pick this up maybe a little slowly, but then more recently a lot more noticeable strides. And then like Joss Whedon has LGBTQ characters, and then of course the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Black Panther and Luke Cage.
Slowly coming along.
Yeah, slowly coming along. It's taken a few years. And part of that adds more complexity to storytelling too. I mean, because of just acknowledging that, thinking about Black Panther, for example, the complexity of a character like Killmonger, very complex. A lot of just different things you're processing when you're seeing that battle that's happening, and some of the things he talked about. But it seems like there's some backlash also that's happening, and especially I think it's very noticeable with Star Wars, like The Last Jedi being an example of that. Tell us a little bit more about your take on that and why it is that a certain semblance of geeks, predominantly white males, let's face it, are having a struggle a bit with this change.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a couple things going on here. The first, of course, is in pop culture, like just the politics of our moment are obviously like greatly, we're living through a period where, you can think that there's always different politics in the culture, but there's times in our culture where maybe politics are a little more monolithic and like top down, and like at least people publicly pretend to agree on the same things. And there's other parts and other periods where like there's just conflicting views that are both mainstream, and people are battling out. And we're clearly in one of those latter moments right now. So everything's politicized these days, and so we would expect pop culture and geek culture to be politicized as well. But I think another thing that's happening is this growth in geek culture and its mainstreaming is really being driven more than anything else, I think, by fans themselves and by geeks themselves. Corporations are coming in and trying to actually monetize it and figure out how to to make money off the demographic. But remember, there were Star Trek fans making their own fan fiction before they figured out how to make those novels. And the geeks were making Star Wars products before Lucas, like the corporations are kind of following behind and coming in and trying to figure out how to actually, to corporatize it. And of course, as like more and more money flows in, it becomes more and more mainstream, more and more visible, more public. But if you think about the kind of people geeks tend to be, the way I describe geeks in the book, and anybody today can be a geek. If anybody wants to say I'm a geek, you're a geek, whatever. It's not like there's like you don't need like a membership card or something, right? But traditionally what geeks are people who tend to be interested in two things at the same time. They tend to like fantasy, of any kind. It could be, animation or puppets, or it could be, science fiction, it could be horror, it could be any of these things. But then they also tend to have, they tend to be more technically minded, and they tend to be interested in the STEM disciplines. They like the sciences, whether it's the hard sciences or the more social sciences, math, engineering, computers, whatever. And what they particularly like is to see the intersection of those two things. So there are people who are interested in fantasy, but aren't interested in seeing a scientific version of fantasy. They want to see like a crazy, irrational. So like someone like David Lynch should be a good example of that. He likes fantasy, he likes the supernatural, but he likes it to be mysterious and weird and like more like a nightmare or something. What geeks tend to do is they kind of come in, they're interested in fantasy, but what they want to do is they want to treat the supernatural as an extension of the natural. They want to actually figure out what the scientific laws are, or the biological, like what's the history of this like, of elves, or what's their culture like, what's their language like. And so they begin to kind of take the supernatural and the fantastical and bring it in under rational, empirical, methodologies and tools and frameworks, and try to actually understand it that way. So it's this intersection of like the STEM disciplines and fantasy, I think, that like traditionally is like what defines the geek. So if you think about it that way, you've always had people of all different walks of life being interested in fantasy, but the STEM disciplines in particular traditionally were, if you go back historically, if we go back like and think to like the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, it tended to be a whiter male, discipline for various reasons. My mom in high school was really interested in science. She wanted to be a marine biologist, and she was told when she was in high school, you can't be that, you can't do that, you should be an English major instead, or you should become a nurse or something. So she didn't become a marine biologist. hopefully that attitude has changed today. And as the STEM disciplines and tech jobs and things like that are themselves diversifying, which is long overdue, of course, you're seeing geek culture also diversify and grow. And again, like that's something I think that's being driven by the fans themselves. And so the companies are a little slower to pick up on this. But again, they're cautious. They're trying to figure out how to like safely monetize this. In terms of a backlash, I think part of what you're seeing, of course, is that for a long time, a certain group of people perceived geek culture as being, their underground niche, And I think it's two things. I think one is a lot of geeks are kind of resentful to see it go mainstream. The same way, like if you're a fan of like an underground band and then you see them go mainstream, on some level you feel like, maybe you've lost something. You haven't. Pop culture belongs to everybody, and you can still go back and listen to the earlier albums. But like, look, when I was growing up, I loved X-Men comics, and I suffered from this myself. Like when I saw them making the X-Men movies in 1999, 2000, on some level I felt resentful about it. Because it wasn't the X-Men I knew. Like I was like, look, it looks like the Matrix. They're wearing like black leather jumpsuits. They're using wire fu. That's not the X-Men. The X-Men is like, when I was reading it in 1986 and they were in the Australian outback and it was like the team was Longshot, Rogue, Dazzler, Wolverine, Colossus, and it's like Havoc, like Storm. Like that's the X-Men, I don't want to see, they're changing things. So I get it. Like I felt like, it wasn't exactly what I wanted. But here's the thing, like, I was reading X-Men in 1986. It's like there were X-Men fans in 1976. Like I was the new kid on the block who looked obnoxious to them. Like, what are you talking about, 1986 X-Men? It's not the 1976 X-Men. And you have the 1966 X-Men fans. We're like, wait a minute, hold on, we were here first. The thing about pop culture is that it belongs to everybody, and it keeps evolving, and it has to kind of keep evolving. And it keeps being, it keeps going in the directions of our own interests. I write in the book that pop culture characters, they don't die, they don't live, they don't die. The thing that happens to them is that we might lose interest in them. So if you look at like a franchise like, look at a character like Dick Tracy right now. Dick Tracy seems to me, if people even remember Dick Tracy, it's like there's not much action happening on the Dick Tracy front, right? Like there was the movie back in 1990. I guess the cartoon, the comic is still being made. Like, is he still talking to like the wrist radio thing? It's like there's probably some Dick Tracy fans out there. They're probably mostly over the age of 40, maybe over the age of 60, and if you're going to make something that appeals to people today, you kind of have to update it to the present day. So I think the smarter, something what the Star Wars franchise has done is like, yeah, like the time it was made, it's like, there's like way too many guys in it. It's like overwhelmingly white, It's like, if you want to update it today and you want to actually like make it appeal to the people who are the geeks today, like, absolutely, like it should be much more diverse. And I think, as geek culture, it's like a confluence of these things. It's like, as the geek industries themselves diversify, as it becomes more mainstream, as our pop culture, fights out these political battles, you're going to see those trends continue. So the two things I think we can say about geek culture is, one, I don't think we're anywhere near like it's going to become as big as it is now. It is going to keep getting bigger. And then two, I think also like the side is totally on the side of like greater diversity and all those things in geek culture. It's just that part seems to be taking a bit of that seems to be lagging behind a bit more. I think 2014, 2016 have kind of been inflection points with Gamergate and then the election of Trump. I think a lot of these things have kind of bubbled to the surface and like really broke through in a way and created visibility for forces that people weren't paying attention to before that. So yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes left. In just a minute, we're going to open up for Q&A. So be thinking of your questions, and the microphone is just right over there. So be thinking about that. We only have time probably for one question from me. So I'm thinking from the list here. So let's talk about diverse experiences a little bit. So in the book, you talk a little bit about how you'd love to experience the Star Trek holodeck. And I think you also mention, like in the book about holodeck addiction, right? But the point I'm really getting to is around new technologies and the use of new technologies. We could go in a lot of territory here, but the use of technology for storytelling, I think that's where I would like to get your opinions. For emerging storytellers, people who are thinking about world building, who know that they have to create rich, dense stories if they're going to be the Harry Potter of 10 years from now.
Yeah, so I mentioned that like the way I define a geek in the book are people. It's again this intersection between people who like fantasy, the supernatural, whatever that entails, and then try to bring like a a more technical or scientific or like engineering-based mindset to bear upon it, and they want to see the intersection of those two things. That's a large part of why geeks like realism, is because, you know, in a lot of ways, what they want to do is they want to produce this sense that the other world actually exists as much as possible, like we saw with the role-playing game. So any kind of technology that allows them to do that, if you think about it, like a movie is a technology for having a fantasy, a book is a technology for having a fantasy, a comic book is that. And, you know, I think a lot of geeks, what they're driven then to do is to try to create immersive experiences that allow them to actually feel like they're living in that, you know, that other world. And having that experience, they want to be as complete, like you want to actually be in there and you want to be able to like believe you're actually in that world and forget that you were, I mean, I know I do. Like, I mean, I would like more than anything else to go live on the Starship Enterprise. You know, it's like, it seems like a much better place than, in particular the Next Generation Enterprise, but like, it just seems like a better place than like, you know, a lot of where we currently live. I'd love to live in that world, you know? So if somebody actually could build like a replica of the Starship Enterprise and I could actually just go walk around in it, that would be like my life's dream come true, you know? It's like the best I'm gonna get if I can't actually go live in that world. But you know, I mean, if somebody creates like a virtual reality headset where I can actually experience that, I'd love that. And I think one of the things you're seeing with, people are trying to do that with VR and stuff, but one of the more recent evolutions, and I'm not surprised by this, is the creation of theme parks that are branded around, you know, like a model around particular brands. Like the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, where you go in, you get the wand, you can actually interact with things. Again, it's like you're going to Hogwarts. You know, it's like this amazing experience. They're doing it with Avatar, they're doing it with Star Wars. So I think, again, they're trying to figure out how to, because they have this demographic, how they can create that experience for, you know, people who will go and will spend, just like, no, I want this particular one, I'll spend $80 on it or whatever, and, you know, have that experience. So, but yeah, but from any, you know, it could be VR, it could be 3D movies, it could be video games, you know, it could be just building the things, you know, that people like to build replicas of things and stuff, so, yeah. But it's to have that immersive experience.
Yeah, immersive, real, lived in.
Yeah,
Definitely.
A realist, yeah. It should look like an actual other world you've gone to.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, you know, my cell phone screen is cracked, so why shouldn't the droids have some scuffs on them? You know, that's what the real world looks like. So we get hurt, you know, so our character should get hurt. So.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so we have time for a few questions. The microphone is over there, so feel free to step up to the mic.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us. I actually was an English major and a fantasy nerd, but I was a Victorianist, so I definitely identify with your high and low concept and literary criticism idea. And so my undergraduate dissertation was on Jacques Derrida's concept of the archive, fan fiction, copyright, and Tolkien.
Wow. Okay.
And the Tolkien estate was very, very anti the fandom participating in and extending the basically he went after a lot of copyright issues. And I've watched that kind of evolve, and I'm very curious what you think about how fandoms are kind of appropriating things, continuing to expand universes, and then that fight between what's canon, what's not, where they step on copyright issues, these sorts of issues that you're getting to talk about now.
Yeah. I have a background in Victorian studies myself, too, part of my, you know, and actually, it's related because, you know, the Victorians had, I mean, you see an explosion of literacy and of reading in Victorian culture, and to this day, one of the conflicts in Victorian studies is like, what are the actual works of literature? What are the more genre, you know, pulp stuff? So that's part of the relationship, my interest in those two things. Yeah, the Tolkien estate's a funny one because they, you know, when they first approached Tolkien, like in the 60s, about making a movie out of The Lord of the Rings, they could see it was like growing in popularity among especially like young people, hippies, you know. And they said, his agent said to him, well, do you want them to do this? And Tolkien said, one of two things. If they won't give me any money for it, then we should insist on high art. Like, it should be a great film. But if they'll give me a lot of money, then I don't care what they make. You know, it was like, what are the other? And they actually ended up selling the rights. And then the rights, there's a really interesting book on this called the Frodo franchise by Kristen Thompson, where she kind of went through the whole history of like how the rights were caught up in legal battles and why the movies in some ways, besides like the animated versions, didn't really end up getting made until the late 90s, the early 2000s. But yeah, like the Tolkien estate though has tried to control in a lot of ways, and they don't like the Peter Jackson movies and have they're like, you're never making the Silmarillion, et cetera, et cetera. And they also claim they haven't made it, they've never got any of the money from it and stuff. But the thing about it is, like, I understand that if you're talking about like officially licensed Tolkien stuff, but at some point that copyright will run out. But I'm a real firm believer that pop culture just belongs to everybody. Anyone who's interested in it, anybody who reads it and has it. When I was a kid, I loved Lloyd Alexander novels, the Prydain Chronicles. They were some of the first books I fell in love with. They made a Disney film, The Black Cauldron, out of them. They're supposedly trying to make a TV show. And I sat there and I wrote, like, those books end, if you get to the fifth one, that they end. But I wrote Prydain Chronicles, Lloyd Alexander fan fiction, and I imagined myself into those stories and meeting, Taran and Eilonwy and Henwen, like all those characters and stuff. And you can't stop people from doing that. I don't see why anybody would want to, Now, I think the question then becomes, like, anybody can do that, but then if other people like it, it'll go on and have a life outside that. If you want to write your own Star Wars fan fiction, you can do that, or your own Lord of the Rings fan fiction. But, like, it doesn't mean anybody else is going to want to read it, So, but the things that people like will go on and become, fan favorites, and maybe will eventually get picked up by the, by these companies. I think they're actually foolish if they ignore those segments of the fan base. Like with Star Wars, it's like Mara Jade is clearly a beloved character in the Star Wars universe. Like, why they have not introduced her into the movies, I just think that's foolish of them. They should, that kind of thing. And similarly, if there's somebody, I'm not quite as up on Tolkien fan fiction, but like, if there's somebody out there who's writing really good Tolkien fan fiction and people like it, I think they should look to that and maybe try to adapt it or something,
I always thought it was really interesting because Tolkien himself was such a scholar of, Norwegian mythology,
Greek mythology. He was basically ripping off a lot of
Totally.
archival universal stuff anyway, so I thought it was a bit hypocritical.
Oh yeah, like this stuff comes from from Beowulf. It comes from the Nibelungen. It's like he took stuff left and right. So yeah. I mean, culture belongs to everybody. It's just yeah.
Hello, thanks for coming. I'm just wondering, in your definition of geek and sort of focusing on people who are interested in STEM, it seems to exclude a large portion of like the mainstream people who might identify as geek and are starting to like the kind of people who are really excited about Big Bang Theory, or you mentioned Harry Potter. How do you see those two worlds sort of intersecting? Where's the middle there? Like, there's certainly people who travel in between those worlds. Like, what's in the middle?
Yeah, so I mean, I do define geek a particular way in the book, and it's in a lot of ways what the book's about is like the past 40 years of geek culture. Like, it's kind of how we've had 40 years of Star Wars now, and we've had like how did the Star Wars franchise grow up and change like in those 40 years, and how did geek culture change during that time period too? And it's changed a lot, and it's going to keep changing. One of the things that is happening, of course, is that as it becomes more mainstream, the definition of it is becoming a lot more diffuse. And that's just an inevitable, like, again, it's not that different from something like, punk going mainstream. Punk music is something I'm really interested in. And, if you go back in time to 1976, and who would identify as a punk or being interested in punk music? I mean, it's a very specialized, thing. Because it's a subculture, it's a small culture. Even by the time you get to 1978, 1979, what counts as punk music is already like really diffuse, and nowadays, if you like, what counts as that is like all over the place, So there's nothing to stop that, and I don't even think it's like a thing that should be stopped. As geek culture goes mainstream, you're going to see something that maybe was more of like a highly specialized kind of term, or like it was more specific in like a couple different identities it referred to. It's going to expand, and so yeah, I think you have like very casual geek fans these days. I mean, it's how it is. I mean, in a lot of ways, but like people who are like hardcore geeks and stuff should be really grateful for that, because that's like, like if it were just the geeks, like if you go back in time to like, how many people would have shown up to watch an Avengers movie in like 1975? It probably wouldn't have made any money. So they wouldn't have been able to make it. If you liked Infinity War, if you liked the Marvel Cinematic Universe, if you liked the fact, like the fact that Infinity War just crossed $2 billion globally, the only way it can do that is if a lot of people beyond, like there's a lot more geeks now than there used to be, but even if all the geeks in the world showed up and saw it like 10 times, it still wouldn't make $2 billion globally. Like, it wouldn't even come close. So there's a lot of people who are more casual fans who are showing up as well. And look, like, if they want to say they're geeks, like, whatever, you know, they're geeks. Like, I mean, I think of it more as a spectrum. There's like, on one level, it's like people who are just kind of like the most casual fans you can imagine. And then at the other end, you have like the most diehard fans who know like every single thing and are completely obsessed. And I'm not even a dad in myself. Like, I don't know where I am. I'm somewhere on that spectrum. I'm probably closer to the more enfranchised end, you know, but like, maybe it's not even like 75%. Trust me, in writing this book, I've met people who are far more into it than I am and know far more, you know, into it. I mean, I know people who like, you know, all they wear at home is a Starfleet uniform. You know, so it's like, that's great. And then you have, on the other hand, you have some people who just want to go to Target and buy a T-shirt and they're a geek, and that's, you know, but that's the sign that it's going mainstream. The fact I think it's in many ways a lovely thing that like, it's something that's more accessible to people and they can choose their level of engagement with it. You know, it doesn't have to be, because it used to be like, if you wanted to read, I mean, again, I go back to X-Men comics in the 80s, but like, if you wanted to read these things, it was hard to find them, and I'm happier now that they're accessible to more people. So, does that answer the question? Or
yeah, thanks. I also selfishly appreciate that it's going more mainstream because I think it encourages more gender diversity.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Howdy.
Hi.
I've not read your book yet. And at the risk
I forgive you.
We have copies.
At the risk of giving away the nucleus of your argument, I want to know what interpretation I can expect to take away from the title.
Oh, yeah.
I find your lack of faith disturbing. How do you tie that in?
Yeah, so when I wrote the book, I was just calling it Star Wars and the Triumph of Geek Culture, and my publisher said to me, we have to have a thing to put in front of that. And I said, well, why? And they said, because we have to. And I said, okay, so I mean, that was their decision. So then they said to me, we want to call it, what was it they want to call it? They said, we want to call it, oh man, I wish I could think of it. They had another line from Star Wars they wanted to use, and it was terrible, because it sounded like I was insulting geek culture. I will come back to me what it was. And it was, I have a bad feeling about this, Star Wars and Triumph of Geek Culture. I said, first of all, that's like the biggest Star Wars cliche you can possibly imagine. And I said, it's also just completely wrong. I love my publisher. FSG is a great press. They're a bit more of a literary press. They're not so much like a geekier, even like the science fiction stuff they do, they have, they tend to do things like the Southern Reach trilogy and stuff, so it's a little more like literary, like they want to call it like speculative fiction and stuff. So anyway, I said, no, that's completely wrong. So then I was like, okay, I'm on the hook now. I better come up with a better expression, a better line from Star Wars, or else they're going to like completely ruin this book. So, and you should have seen the cover they originally wanted to put on this too. It was like this like sad emo Darth Vader like crying or something. I was like, guys, you're not marketing this book to hipsters. You're marketing it to geeks. So, yeah, there's an intersection between geeks and hipsters too. But I said this is a book for geeks, and so this book is a defense of geek culture. Like I want to defend there's plenty of books and articles out there telling you what's wrong with geek culture. This is a defense of geek culture, and it's a defense of it on like artistic grounds, moral grounds, cultural grounds. It's like a full-throated defense of geek culture. So I said, well, how about this one? I said, I actually went through, I just watched Star Wars again. I wrote down anything could possibly be a title in front of it. And finally I went, okay, I find your lack of faith disturbing, because I thought that one works because it means two different things, right? Like, it's true, if you're a geek on some level, when you meet non-geeks, especially if you find out those non-geeks are going to be in charge of making like the new Star Wars movie or you get scared because you find their lack of faith disturbing. It's like you don't want them to be in charge of making, the best example is to be like Michael Bay making the Transformers movies, right? A lot of people who are geeks hate the Transformers movies because they're not very geeky. And so, when Michael Bay was going to make Turtles movies, people get scared, right? So there's that. You want to find out instead that, people you trust and who are fellow geeks are making these things. But at the same time, I think the people who are outside geek culture, there is something a little like, it looks a bit maybe like a cult or religion or something like, so it kind of goes a little both ways. It's like, it is like, these geeks like, and again, that's like from my own experience. I remember being like 15 years old, 14 years old, and like going over to my friends' houses and talking to their parents about The Princess Bride and why they should watch it, and probably talking about it for like an hour. and then being like, why is he just talking about this this movie and this book for like an hour? Like it's insane. It's crazy. You know, it's absurd. So yeah, it kind of cuts both ways, I think. So I wanted to get that duality in the title, if that makes sense. But they made me put something on the front. I wouldn't have thought of that on my own. That's a market force at work on me, you know. So I don't know why they had to have the title. But they say it sells better if you have the title. I don't. Although now they refer to it as "I find your lack of faith disturbing," and I'm like, I'd rather call it Star Wars and the Triumph of Geek Culture. That gets more to what the book's about, you know. But they keep calling it "I find your lack of faith disturbing" now. So.
All right. And with that, I think we have come to the end of the hour. I would love to ask more questions, but we have to sadly end. But thankfully, you're going to be sticking around for a few minutes.
Oh yeah, yeah. And if people want me to sign copies, or if you had a question you didn't get a chance to ask, I'd love to hear it. And you know, so.
Yeah, we have books for sale in the back, and Adam will be sticking around. The book is "I Find Your Lack of Faith Disturbing: Star Wars and the Triumph of Geek Culture." Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.